To become an Anglican minister in Sydney requires going through a long, drawn-out process. Now, it takes several years. You have to have several reports and letters of recommendation, several panel interviews, and you need a psychological assessment. Now, I've mentioned this before, but my psych report said that Brendan is, quote, emotionally bland. Emotionally bland. When my wife Deb read that report, she was really upset. She said, I can't believe they would say something that negative. Doesn't that upset you, Brendan? And I said, Now, the reason I mention that is because that description, emotionally bland, it was picked up in one of the panel interviews. And that panel wanted to know if I would be able to connect to people on an emotional level. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, what? Brendan is the most empathetic person I've ever met. He's like a walking hug. But the reason that they brought this up is because when the wrong person slips through the system, they can actually do enormous damage to a church. You see, when a church suffers at the hands of a bully, or they get taught liberal theology, or if a minister has an affair with someone in the congregation, that can take the church sometimes 5, even 10 years to recover. Right? So we want to make sure we get the right person for the job. And this is what we're looking at in our passage today. We're looking at what makes a person suitable for Christian service. All right, so far we've seen over the last 3 weeks that the letter of 2 Corinthians was written because certain false teachers, whom Paul sarcastically refers to later in the letter as super apostles, certain super apostles had infiltrated the church in Corinth. And they wanted the Corinthian Christians to sit under their teaching and support their ministry financially. Now, this was quite a common thing in the first century. All right, itinerant preachers or philosophers, they would travel from city to city and they would ask those benefiting from their teaching to support them financially. Now, the problem for these super apostles was Corinth already had an apostle, the Apostle Paul. Right, the church in Corinth was founded by Paul. We get that from Acts chapter 18. And Paul would visit them from time to time as his missionary journeys would permit. So these so-called super apostles, they started bad-mouthing Paul so that the Corinthians would stop supporting Paul's ministry and start supporting them. And so far in this letter, Paul has dealt with 2 of their charges, okay? His extensive suffering, which we looked at in our first week, and his changed travel plans, which we looked at 2 weeks ago. Well, in today's passage, Paul goes and puts himself up against these super apostles, all right? He puts himself side by side and he says, what really qualifies a person for Christian ministry? What are the main ingredients that God is looking for in a Christian minister? But when I say Christian minister, I don't just mean me. You see, the main ingredients Paul discusses in this passage applies to any Christian who wants to serve the Lord, right? So whether you're helping with welcoming or on morning tea, or if you're, a missionary overseas or an ordained Anglican minister, our passage today is outlining what the main ingredients are that God is looking for in his servants. And there are 3 main ingredients in this passage, which are our 3 points for today. So we're going to start by looking at the need for empathy and love in ministry, and I've titled that A Heart for Ministry. That's verses 12 and 13. We'll then look at how Christian ministry is conducted, all right? And I've titled that The Process of Ministry. That's verses 14 to 17. And we'll then conclude by seeing what makes a person an effective servant, which I've titled The Power Behind Ministry. And that's chapter 3, verses 1 to 6. And look, we're going to need our Bibles open today. This is a very difficult passage to begin with. But on top of that, each of these 3 ingredients are actually quite shocking. Be prepared to be shocked today as we look at who is sufficient for Christian ministry. And our passage today picks up where what we were looking at 2 weeks ago. So as I mentioned last week, verses 5 to 11 were kind of a detour or a side quest, if you will, from Paul's train of thought. And Paul's train of thought was him explaining his changed travel plans. Corinthians, okay? So Paul had initially planned to visit Corinth on the way to, like he was visiting them in person on the way to, and then returning from his visit to Macedonia. We learnt that in 1 verse 16. But his first visit was so painful, chapter 2, verse 1, that he decided to spare the Corinthians a second painful visit, 1:23, and he wrote them a letter instead. And we've been referring to this now lost letter as 1.5 Corinthians. And we pick up Paul's train of thought in chapter 2, verse 12. Now, when I went to Troas to preach the gospel of Christ, and I found that the Lord had opened a door for me, I still had no peace of mind because I did not find my brother Titus there. So I said goodbye to them and went on to Macedonia. Now, once again, we need to read between the lines a bit here because Paul doesn't finish the story. The very jarring gear change in verse 14 has led some scholars to think that verse 14 and onwards is actually a completely different letter that some redactor shoved together with verse 13 and before years later. But the reason Paul doesn't finish the story is because the Corinthians already knew what happened. Right? They didn't need some clunky bit of Hollywood exposition. The problem is, we do. All right? And our best guess is that Paul sent 1.5 Corinthians to Corinth with Titus. Okay? There was no Australia Post back then, so if you wanted to send a letter somewhere, you needed to send it with someone who was going that way. And so Titus was one of Paul's closest friends and companions, like ministry servants, fellow workers, and he even gets his own letter in the New Testament. And so the plan was for Titus to go and deliver this letter to the Corinthians, and then Paul would go to Troas to preach the gospel, and Titus would then meet him later on in Troas. And when Paul goes to Troas, a mini revival breaks out. Like when the New Testament says a door had opened, verse 12, that's code for people being open to the Christian message in record numbers. And friends, there is very little that gives Christians a bigger thrill than seeing people being open to the Christian message. Right? Like every time we run the Alpha course here or Christianity Explained, the church members who come along to those programs, those nights, they are the ones that go home on a high. Every session. Right? If you don't believe me, just ask people like Nick or Angela or Cassandra or Neil. Like, why do you think these people keep coming back term after term? It's because it gives you a thrill, it gives you a high to see people talking about Christianity. If you want that high, come and talk to me. You can come along to the next one we're kicking off soon. And so Paul would have been on a massive high in Troas. Now, it's not a drug-induced high, it's a gospel-induced high. A door had been opened to him. And this is what makes verse 13 so shocking. I still had no peace of mind because I did not find my brother Titus there. So I said goodbye to them and went on to Macedonia. Right? If Paul is on this gospel-induced high, then why does he leave? Well, it could be anxiety over Titus's safety. Right? Why hasn't he come to Troas yet? But the context of 2 Corinthians suggests Paul is worried about how 1.5 Corinthians was received. Right? Had his letter of rebuke alienated or healed the Corinthians? See, the reason Paul left fruitful mission work behind was because he was anxious about one of his churches. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul lists all the different ways he suffered as an apostle. All right? Remember his shipwrecks, his beatings, his imprisonments. This is how that list ends. This is 2 Corinthians 11:28. Besides everything else, besides all the shipwrecks and the beatings and the whippings and the floggings, besides everything else, I face daily the pressure of my concern for all the churches. To be an effective servant of the Lord, whether it be paid or unpaid, you need to have a heart for your church. You need to love your Christian brothers and sisters, right? Paul had such a concern for the Corinthians that he left fruitful gospel work just so he could go and find out how they were, how they reacted to his letter. So friends, do we truly love our brothers and sisters here at Elwood Anglican? Like if someone has been missing at church or Bible study for a couple of weeks, are you on the phone finding out how they are? Do you get upset? Does it hurt your heart if you miss church one week due to an illness? Right? Will you say no to appointments on Sunday because nothing will come before going to church and being mutually encouraged by your Christian brothers and sisters here? Right? Are you fervently praying for the well-being of your fellow church members? Because that's one of the main ingredients of being an effective servant of the Lord. You have a heart for ministry because you have a heart for the saints. Well, if leaving behind fruitful mission work to check up on the Corinthians isn't shocking enough, what Paul says in verse 14 is even more shocking. Read it with me. But thanks be to God. Now, that's not the shocking bit. Reading between the lines, it seems that Paul found Titus, okay, and he heard the good news that the Corinthians had repented. So he says, thanks be to God. He's thanking God. The shocking bit comes next. But thanks be to God who always leads us as captives in Christ's triumphal procession and uses us to spread the aroma of the knowledge of him everywhere. Now, what is this triumphal procession? We need to understand this to be able to understand the verse. Well, the triumphal procession, it was like a public celebration. It's kind of like a modern day ticker tape parade. Okay, and it was thrown for a conquering king when he returned home. So the Roman historian Appian, I think, gives us a bit of a picture of what is involved. So the whole city, it would be like a public holiday, and the whole city would come out and line the streets, particularly the main streets, all right, and just cheer on the returning king with his army. So out the front would be the king, usually Caesar. He'd be like in a horse and carriage, like being on a chariot, being drawn along by some horses. And then just after him was all the generals that were in charge of the soldiers. And then after them was the soldiers, okay? And then right up the back would be captured prisoners. Now, Paul says this about the triumphal procession in 1 Corinthians 4, verse 9. 1 Corinthians 4 verse 9 says, Paul says, "For it seems to me that God has put us apostles on display at the end of the procession, like those condemned to die in the arena." So Paul is he's talking about his own suffering in 1 Corinthians 4:9, but the point is the captives who are on display at the end of the procession are led into the arena, like the Colosseum, to be executed. And this is what Paul seems to be saying about Christians in verse 14. Like we would like to think we Christians would be the soldiers up the front following our King Jesus. But what Paul is saying is we're the enemies Jesus has captured who are being led to our death. Kind of shocking, isn't it? But when we dig a little deeper, we find that this actually lines up with the teaching of the New Testament. So, for example, Romans 5:10 says, while we were God's enemies, Christ died for us. Right? We were all enemies of Christ at some point. And we became Christians when Christ captured us. So, in a sense, we're captives of the kingdom. Or then there's how Jesus tells Christians to take up your cross and follow me. Right? Now, when Jesus took up his cross, he was literally being led as a captive to his execution. But that was to atone for sin, right? What Jesus means when he says that we should take up our cross is we need to be ready to suffer like Christ did. We need to be ready to suffer just for being a Christian. And so in that sense, we're condemned to die. But if that's not shocking enough, Paul says our suffering is how we do gospel ministry. Right? Being prepared to suffer is the process of ministry. But this ministry is not just talking about, the ministry is talking about, he's not just doing morning tea or being on the Bible reading roster. This ministry is actually spreading the good news. It's spreading the gospel. So have a look at verse 15 and 16. For we are to God the pleasing aroma of Christ among those who are being saved and those who are perishing. To the one, we're an aroma that brings death, to the other, an aroma that brings life. So what Paul is saying is, when some people see our willingness to suffer for Christ, they go, man, Christ must be amazing if these people are willing to suffer so much for him. Right? When the Romans saw the Christians literally dying in the arena whilst singing hymns and praying as the lions were ravaging them, they said, man, these people have something I don't have. They have a peace and a security I don't have. Right? So when some people see us taking up our metaphorical cross, they turn to Christ and find life, eternal life. But when others see Christians suffering for Christ, they think, oh, what kind of a horrible God would allow his people to suffer for him? And these people, they turn away from Christ. Right? When some people see us taking up our cross, it leads them to death in hell. Okay? Being led as captives for death is the second ingredient to effective ministry. We need to be willing to let our suffering for Christ be how we spread the gospel, even if it means turning some people away. And this can be hard. Some people can't cope with that. They can't cope with people turning away from Jesus because of them and their ministry. They don't like seeing people recoil from them. And so what they do is they modify the message. And this is what verse 17 is getting at. Have a look. Unlike so many, we do not peddle the word of God for profits. On the contrary, in Christ, we speak before God with sincerity as those sent from God. Now, what is a peddler? A peddler was generally a wine merchant back in the day who would water down their wine so they could sell more. All right, so people they'd taste the wine and go, it's not as good as the top stuff, but I'll still pay top quality because it's almost as good. And Paul says that is not the process of ministry. Right? We speak as though we're speaking before God with absolute sincerity. And so here's application point number 2 for today. So number 1 was develop a heart, all right, a love for the saints at Irwood Anglican. Number 2 is always speak about Christ with absolute sincerity, even if it means bringing some to death. That's how ministry is done. Right? What Paul is saying is a vibrant Christian ministry is not a life of strength. Like we would much rather be up the front with as the conquering generals, right? But no, a vibrant ministry is a death march. We follow in the steps that Jesus himself marked out for us on his way to the cross. Right? If the gospel is going to go out from us, it will go out in weakness and in death. So, the kind of servants God is looking for are those who love his people, who have a heart for his people, and those who are willing to die daily, whether that be literally or metaphorically, all right, so that the gospel can go out from us, even if it means we're the aroma of death, all right? This only leaves one question. And Paul preempts this at the end of verse 16. Have a look at verse 16. Right at the end he says, and who is equal to such a task? Now, the word literally translated there means who is sufficient for such a task. And in chapter 3, verses 1 to 6, he tells us. All right, so starting in verse 1, are we beginning to commend ourselves again, or do we need, like some people, letters of recommendation to you or from you? So, here's Paul. He's putting himself side by side with the super apostles to compare the two. And he says, look, the super apostles have these letters of recommendation, supposedly from the Jerusalem apostles, totally fake though. So Paul says, look, do I too need letters of recommendation so that you will accept me? Well, if so, verse 2, you yourselves are our letter, written on our hearts, known and read by everyone. All right, the simple fact that the Corinthians turned to Christ, now I don't mean the whole city, but the Christians turned to Christ, is Paul's letter of recommendation. His gospel ministry in Corinth bore the fruit that is their faith. And that is a witness to everyone. It is known and read by everyone who sees them. And so here's the thing. The super apostles, they have their letters of recommendation. Paul has a letter of recommendation. So that's not going to show who's legit. So what does separate the wheat from the chaff? What is this third and final ingredient behind authentic ministry? Well, the answer once again is shocking. Have a look at verse 5. Not that we are competent in ourselves to claim anything for ourselves, but our competence comes from God. Now, the word competent there, it's the same word in Greek used that Paul used back up in his question in chapter 2, verse 16. Who is sufficient for ministry? The one who knows they're not sufficient for ministry. Now, the reason this is shocking is because it's ironic. Paul's confidence that he is better equipped for ministry than these super apostles, Paul's confidence that he is more sufficient for ministry than these super apostles, is rooted in how he knows he's not sufficient for ministry. And this is how God has always chosen his heroes of faith. See, when God called Moses, Moses said, I'm not eloquent of speech. When God called Gideon, Gideon said, I am the weakest man of the weakest tribe, of the weakest clan. And when God called Jeremiah, Jeremiah said, I'm too young. God always chooses people who know they are insufficient for the task. Now, why is this? It's to show that our sufficiency comes from God. The story of Gideon is a perfect example of this. When God called Gideon, Gideon mustered 32,000 soldiers. It was an enormous army. But the problem was the Midianites, we believe, had over 130,000 soldiers. They were outnumbered like at least 4-1. But God said to Gideon, you have too many men for me to save Israel with. And so God told Gideon to whittle down his 32,000 soldiers to just 300. Now, why is this? It's to show that our victory, our sufficiency, doesn't come from us. It comes from God. All right, verse 6, he has made us competent, sufficient as ministers of the new covenant. All right, Paul says, I had weakness and God had strength, so we teamed up. And that, brothers and sisters, is the final ingredient to authentic gospel ministry. This is not false humility. It's not pretend modesty. It is the knowledge that Paul could have been the smartest theologian on the planet. He could have been the greatest teacher in Christendom. He could have been the most convincing orator the church has ever seen. He could have been the most passionate evangelist who ever lived. But nothing he could do would be of any consequence for the kingdom unless the Lord worked in him. So our third and final piece of application for today is this. Before you do anything for the Lord, acknowledge that in spite of whatever gifts or skills or talent or intellect or passion God might have blessed you with, acknowledge that you are still insufficient for whatever task is before you and ask God to make you sufficient. Right? That's what I do for every sermon. It takes me about 12 to 14 hours to write a sermon each week. About 2 of those hours is spent purely praying for the sermon and asking for God's sufficiency to help me write the kind of sermon he can use most powerfully. And here's the thing, he comes through every week, but even though he comes through every week, and even though I turn up every Sunday with a sermon, every Monday I'm insufficient again. And they're the main ingredients that God is looking for. He's looking for disciples who have a heart for their fellow disciples. He's looking for disciples who are willing to be weak and die, whether it be metaphorically or literally, to make new disciples. And he's looking for disciples who know they're insufficient for ministry. Let me close with a story of Hudson Taylor. Hudson Taylor is one of the most famous missionaries in the history of the church. He founded the China Inland Mission. It's now called OMF, still going. And someone once said to him, how did you pull it off? How did you do such amazing ministry in China? And he said, God chose me because I was weak enough. Not that we are competent in ourselves to claim anything for ourselves, but our competence comes from God.